Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really glad you're joining us. Today, we're opening up a pretty remarkable set of sources. We've got our hands-on excerpts from a deeply personal family history, basically a tribute book titled Christopher Balanced Borders.
Right, and it is a phenomenal historical record.
Yeah.
Honestly, it functions as a blueprint for familial organization, just sort of disguised as a memoir.
Yeah, exactly. And our mission for today's deep dive is to explore the life of the man at the center of it, Christopher Obulemire Mutende. We're going to look at how he overcame just enormous childhood adversity, navigated some incredibly intense cultural pressures, and ultimately built a thriving, fiercely united family legacy. A legacy that today spans over 5,000 members.
5,000 individuals. It's staggering when you actually stop and consider the organizational framework required to sustain that. I mean, what we are really going to extract from his life are profound insights on generational wealth.
Yeah.
But we aren't talking about capital in a trust fund here.
Right. No.
We're talking about generational wealth in the form of rigid structure and absolute prioritization of education and extreme fairness.
I am so looking forward to analyzing this material with you because Christopher's life really provides masterclass in resilience, particularly when we examine the realities of managing a large polygamous household in rural Kenya during the 20th century. Okay, let's unpack this. Where does Christopher's story actually begin?
Well, it begins with intense and immediate hardship. Christopher was born on January 1st, 1912, and he was orphaned at a very early age.
Wow.
Yeah, and in that era, the survival of an orphan depended entirely on the broader family network. So his older brother, James, steps in as a surrogate father and a role model, making sure Christopher received a formal education. But tragically, James was killed fighting in the First World War.
So Christopher and his younger sister, Phyllis, are just suddenly left to rely on extended relatives for survival. The accounts of his early years detail this young boy surviving by grazing cattle in the village, running petty errands, and hunting birds with a knife and tilly.
The traditional slingshot.
Right, the slingshot simply to pass the time and secure small amounts of food. It's a really stark beginning.
It is, yet he completely transcends those beginnings. Because of the educational foundation that his brother James insisted upon, Christopher actually manages to graduate from Kakamega College as an accountant in 1935.
Which is a massive socioeconomic leap for that time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He transitions completely out of agrarian survival and into the formalized economy. He works as an accounts clerk on a settler's farm in Molo and eventually becomes the head postmaster in Buter, a position he commands for over 40 years.
It's an incredible professional trajectory. But the circumstances of his marriage, I think, provide this fascinating look at the cultural mechanics of the era. So in 1938, the regional custom of abduction marriage was actually a standard practice for forming alliances. Christopher's future first wife, Mama Damari, was just 15 years old at the time.
Right.
She was at the Namasoli market with her cousin, simply shopping for groceries.
And senior community members would regularly scout for hard-working girls at these regional markets. They'd select them and initiate a marriage to men they had never even met.
So 15-year-old Damari is selected. Her cousin is just handed transport money to go home, while Damari is put on a train with guards to ensure she completes the journey. She's relocated over 200 kilometers away to Molo to marry Christopher.
What's fascinating here is how the two of them navigated this highly jarring, established tradition and forged a profoundly respectful, highly effective economic and domestic partnership. We really have to look closely at Mama Deary's immense adaptability.
Yeah.
She was orphaned herself at age 6 and had shouldered heavy responsibilities from a very young age.
She clearly possessed a massive amount of agency. While Christopher was working his formal job, she quickly establishes herself as a brilliant entrepreneur. She recognized the economic opportunities in her new environment and started buying and selling Irish potatoes and fresh vegetables to the bustling Nairobi markets.
And she didn't stop there.
No, later, when they moved back to the village, she completely pivots her business model. She began buying grain during the harvest when prices were low, systematically drying and storing it, and then selling it during periods of scarcity.
She essentially operated with the acumen of a seasoned commodities trader. And Christopher immediately recognized and respected her intelligence. He actually gave her the nickname Jerry Eko, which is a Deluo term meaning the planner or the wise one.
And just to give you, the listener, a bit of context here, Dolo is the language of the neighboring Luo people. So Christopher utilizing a term from a neighboring culture to honor his wife really highlights a level of regional integration and just the deep cross-cultural respect he held for her intellect. I mean, if you just imagine building a life foundation under those circumstances being taken on a train at 15, it really highlights how a shared struggle can forge just unbreakable bonds.
Precisely. She became the de facto chief financial officer of the family. They built their foundation on that shared struggle, intense mutual respect, and undeniable grit.
But that foundation was heavily, heavily tested by the cultural expectations surrounding them.
It was.
After having 3 girls, Otinga, Wambo, and Kwander, they suffered unimaginable heartbreak. They lost their next 2 infant daughters. Rifa passed away at 8 months from pneumonia, and Osumwa passed away at 11 months from severe dehydration. And amidst this immense grief, they face an intense campaign from what the sources describe as traditional village dictators.
Because in that specific regional economy, daughters were often viewed strictly through the lens of dowries. The elders operated under the assumption that daughters would eventually marry and leave the homestead, effectively taking their economic value with them.
Right, so because Demiri was only having girls and tragically losing some, these village leaders heavily pressured Christopher to divorce her. They demanded he produce sons, fearing he would be left impoverished in his old age.
But Christopher completely rejected that demand. He stood his ground and absolutely refused to divorce Demiri.
However, the societal infrastructure of that era required a certain level of conformity just to maintain community standing. So in 1950, a compromise occurred. While Christopher was away, the community arranged a second marriage for him, bringing a young, humble girl named Mama Beatrice into the family.
Which represents a massive operational shift for Christopher. He is now managing a polygamous household that will eventually grow to include 22 children, 12 by Demiri and 10 by Beatrice. Historically, we see many large households in this context fracture along lines of jealousy or resource hoarding. But Christopher managed to engineer a highly functioning, peaceful ecosystem.
But how do you actually engineer peace in that environment? It's one thing to say there was a desire for unity, but human nature inevitably breeds competition, especially among 22 children competing for attention and resources. How did he functionally prevent that?
By establishing absolute non-negotiable operational fairness. The primary rule of the household was that there would be no rationing of food and no discrimination whatsoever between the children of the 2 wives. Mama Beatrice cooked for the entire family as a single unit, and the older sisters were tasked with protecting and mentoring the younger step-siblings as fiercely as their biological ones.
Wow.
It was a mandatory collective identity.
The day-to-day realities of managing that many kids are just fascinating to picture. There's this great anecdote. They had a giant anthill in the homestead called an eshetulo. During dry seasons, the children would carry water to pour over the anthill to make the mud slippery. They'd take large banana stalks, use them as sleds, and just slide down this massive mud hill.
Hey, banana stalks.
Yeah, giant banana stalks as sleds. It was a completely unified group of 20 kids just playing together.
That's incredible. Yet inside the house, Christopher exercised a very quiet but absolute authority. He understood that to survive and thrive outside the village, these children needed rigorous mental discipline.
His methods for enforcing that discipline were quite unique. He was known as a gentleman, but the moment he walked into a room where the children were studying, there was instant silence. He would walk up to the table, pick up one of their exercise books, which had mathematical tables printed on the back covers, and he would just fire off rapid mental arithmetic questions.
They were required to answer instantly, relying purely on rote memorization and quick cognitive processing.
Yeah, and one of his sons, Mutende, who is known as the household comedian, would frequently get caught off guard. When he got the math wrong, his required consequence was to run laps around the perimeter of the house while loudly repeating the correct mathematical answer.
That's hilarious.
Christopher wouldn't raise his voice or scold him. He would just quietly look down and smile to himself while Mutende ran his laps.
A brilliant psychological tactic, honestly. He avoided loud authoritarianism, which often breeds resentment, and instead instituted a system of calm, inevitable accountability. He was preparing them for a highly competitive world.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because demanding academic excellence at the kitchen table is one thing. Scaling that expectation to 22 children and physically paying for their formal education requires a massive financial apparatus.
It does. And Christopher viewed formal education as the ultimate socioeconomic equalizer. He was particularly focused on protecting his daughters. In that environment, girls who remained in the village without prospects were incredibly vulnerable to early circumstances that would severely limit their potential.
Right.
His strategy was to secure placements for his daughters in boarding schools, physically removing them from village vulnerabilities and elevating their academic trajectories.
And the strategy yielded incredible results. His eldest daughter, Penina Otinga, achieved something monumental. She scored high enough to be admitted into the Alliance Girls High School. For you listening, it's crucial to understand that Alliance Girls isn't just a good regional school. It is the premier, most competitive national public school for girls in Kenya. For a young girl from a rural village to secure a spot, there is an astronomical achievement that shifts the trajectory of the entire family.
But the logistical puzzle remains: how does a rural postmaster finance tuition for 22 children?
Yeah, exactly.
He couldn't do it simultaneously. So he implemented a framework known within the family as the ripple effect module.
Break the mechanics of this ripple effect down for us.
Yeah.
How did it actually function day to day?
It functioned as a mandatory internal tax system. The rule was clear. Once an older sibling completed their education and secured formal employment, they became financially responsible for the school fees of the younger siblings. It was not a polite request.
Right.
It was an integrated structural obligation of belonging to the family.
We see a perfect example of this with Penina. After benefiting from the system herself, Penina fully funded the primary and secondary education of her younger sister. She then paid for that sister's enrollment in the rigorous nursing program at the Kenyatta National Hospital in Nairobi. Penina even purchased the return train tickets for her sister during school holidays, specifically to ensure she had safe transit and wouldn't be left vulnerable.
And what makes this system truly resilient is that it expanded outward to include the people who married into the family. The historical records highlight the vital role of the Basakwas, the brothers-in-law, men like Dr. Lawrence Nyakri and Zedok Shimba.
They didn't just marry a daughter, they were absorbed into the ecosystem.
Exactly. They adopted a collective identity. These men utilized their high-ranking social and professional positions in Nairobi to open doors, fund educations, and act as structural pillars for the younger generation. They operated with the exact same level of obligation as biological brothers.
Christopher essentially built a self-sustaining corporation of mutual success. But he also understood human nature well enough to know that even the strongest systems can collapse over asset disputes after the founder is gone, which leads to one of the most compelling strategic decisions he made. In his specific cultural context, writing a formal will was an intense taboo. It was widely believed that documenting your final wishes was an invitation for an early death.
The psychological weight of defying that taboo really cannot be overstated. But Christopher, operating with the pragmatic mindset of an accountant, foresaw that leaving a 5-acre farm and his financial assets undivided would inevitably breed conflict.
So he secretly typed a comprehensive will on his own typewriter. He meticulously divided his assets fairly among his sons to preempt any possible land disputes, sealed it in an envelope, and hid it. He absorbed the psychological burden of a cultural curse just to ensure his family's operational unity would survive his absence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it challenges us to examine the architecture of our own lives. Christopher didn't just passively hope his family would stay together.
No.
He actively designed an institution. I encourage you to look at your current networks. Who are you systematically uplifting, and who's structurally uplifting you? Are the expectations of mutual support clearly defined and enforced, or are they just assumed? Because Christopher left absolutely nothing to assumption.
That is a brilliant lens to view it through, and that precise institutional network he built was eventually subjected to the ultimate stress test.
Yes. The strength of the ripple effect was put on full display, beginning in January of 1973.
It started with a severe accident on January 6th. Christopher was out observing his cattle when a bull from his own herd suddenly charged him. He was knocked violently to the ground, sustaining a massive fracture to his left femur and severe internal bruising.
He was transported to the Kakamega Provincial Hospital. But the medical situation quickly deteriorated. Despite standard treatments, his femur was simply not healing.
Right.
He was immobilized in excruciating pain, and the rural medical facility lacked the diagnostic equipment to understand why a standard fracture was refusing to mend.
This is exactly the moment the network activates. His son-in-law, Dr. Nyakri, recognizes the limitations of the rural hospital. Utilizing his professional influence, Dr. Nyakri arranges an incredibly complex logistical maneuver for 1973. He has Christopher physically airlifted from Kakamega directly to the Armed Forces Memorial Hospital in the capital city of Nairobi.
That level of medical intervention is entirely inaccessible to an average rural citizen. It was only possible because of the successful integrated sons-in-law that Christopher had welcomed into his generational system. In Nairobi, specialists finally possessed the resources to run extensive diagnostics, leading to a bone marrow biopsy.
And the results explained the lack of healing. Christopher was diagnosed with myeloma, a complex bone cancer that severely compromises the skeletal structure, rendering the bones incredibly fragile, basically like glass.
It was an advanced stage diagnosis, but the network continued to operate. Through Dr. Nyakari's channels, the family actually managed to import advanced cancer therapeutics directly from the United Kingdom to slow the progression of the disease.
After months of receiving specialized care in Nairobi while staying with his daughters, Christopher stabilized enough to be discharged in July of 1974. He was driven back to his village, where Mama Damari organized local choirs to celebrate his return, and the household physically reorganized itself to accommodate his crutches.
However, the structural reality of myeloma meant his skeletal system remained fundamentally compromised.
Right. In February of 1975, he woke up in the night to use the restroom. Attempting to move independently so he wouldn't disturb Mama Damari, he relied on his crutches. Tragically, one of the crutches lost traction on a wet patch of floor.
The resulting fall was catastrophic due to the underlying cancer. He suffered another fracture to his right femur and shattered the radius and ulna in both of his arms. He was entirely immobilized and required immediate, round-the-clock medical supervision.
He was rushed back to the Kakamega Provincial Hospital, but the facility was significantly short-staffed, and the geographic distance made it impossible for his wives to commute daily from the village to provide the continuous care he needed. It presented an almost insurmountable logistical challenge for the family.
Yet the very system Christopher spent his life building provided the exact solution he needed in his final months.
It is a stunning full-circle moment. The daughter who documented this history had just graduated from her nursing program, the exact program fully funded by her older sister Penina through Christopher's internal tax system. Seeing the crisis, she immediately requested a professional posting to the Kakamega Provincial Hospital, specifically to manage her father's care.
She was granted the position and became the registered nurse in charge of the outpatients department. Crucially, this role included staff housing on the hospital campus. She immediately moved her mother, Mama Damari, her stepmother, Mama Beatrice, and her Aunt Phyllis into the hospital housing with her.
For his final 5 months, Christopher was surrounded by the core leadership of his family. The women who helped him build his legacy cooked his meals, and the daughter he fought so hard to educate utilized her medical training to manage his pain. The system supported him entirely until he passed away on July 30, 1975. So what does this all mean?
It means that a rigidly enforced system of mutual obligation actually works. He didn't just build a family, he engineered a self-sustaining fortress of human capital. And the evidence of that success is completely undeniable today.
The numbers speak for themselves. That initial household has expanded into a highly organized blended family numbering over 5,000 members. They maintain their collective identity through a massive shared WhatsApp network under the profile OMO, standing for Mutende's Sons. They mobilize resources, celebrate victories, and solve problems collectively. The ripple effect Christopher initiated in the mid-20th century is fully operational today.
This raises an important question. How do we define what we leave behind? True generational wealth isn't an inheritance you passively receive. Christopher Mutende's life demonstrates that wealth is a rigorously maintained system of mutual support. It requires uncompromising fairness, the courage to selectively defy cultural norms that hinder progress, and a demand for excellence that elevates the entire group.
I think that is the perfect distillation of his life. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today to analyze such a complex and rewarding set of sources. We've spent a lot of time analyzing the past, but I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought about your present. We often assume that a legacy is a static document we leave behind when we die. But looking at Christopher Obulemire Mutende, it is abundantly clear that a true legacy is a living, breathing system that you must actively manage, test, and enforce every single day while you are alive. If you were to draw out the ripple effect of your own life right now, who is actively in your system, and more importantly, what exact rules of obligation are you teaching them to pass on to the next generation? Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. We will see you next time.